As you know, I'm always given to creating new names for the same thing, so this isn't a seminar, which is what you do when you're studying under a curriculum. The Institute is the possibility for us to get together informally under no pressure to do anything but enjoy our having direct access to one of the makers and doers and thinkers in the field of contemporary art and thought. So this is part like a masterclass, but it also, as an institute, is based on my other favourite occupation or film, Field of Dreams, which is this question of that which happens is because people come. If people don't come, there isn't an event. Carolyn and I could talk to each other for the rest of the time, and we still wouldn't finish. But it's the presence of everybody else. So what we want to do is to welcome Carolyn and thank her very much again. Welcome you all for coming and apologise for the slight inconvenience of this cramped space to start off with, which will get better. What we would like to do this morning is to start with giving you, who were at the lecture or in a slightly more informal environment, if you've had a chance to think through it, to bring any questions that you have to the table, any comments, to set the discussion going amongst us, so that Carolyn can also have a sense of
feedback.
As
Bateson would say.
Exactly, we'll be very Batesonian. And then we're going to look at a few more of the works that we rushed through yesterday. And then we'll, in the afternoon session, we'll begin to take up some text, but it may be that you suddenly say you do want to talk about one of the texts as a result of your reading. So a little bit free-form, but vague sense of order. So let's start off with opening it up to some comments or discussions or responses or feedback or anything that you would like to put on the table for Carolyn to respond to from the lecture. Now that's obviously immediately I can see everybody's anxiety is just going across their faces. Oh God, we have to do something. But we'll be Quaker-like about it.
Yes, Quaker. We can sit and wait. Yes. Anyway, thank you for being here after the lecture, and it's a pleasure for me to be back. I really enjoyed it last time and learned a lot, so happy to learn again.
Juliet.
Well, I was asking about the practices that you talked about were non-human animals making, producing, engineering, building, playing, designing,
seducing, passing time,
and also maybe venting frustrations in other contexts, and drawing, painting, all of those things I see as specific practices that occur in specific contexts. And where I struggle is with it, bringing it within an overarching context of this is art, because I'm not sure whether it is or not, and that's what I struggle with, I suppose. So I wondered if you could say more about what the terms and definitions of art are within which those appear, because I see them as things that can be read by artists and interpreted within an art discussion of art and brought into art contexts, but that doesn't necessarily mean their making is art.
Okay. And
although I don't dispute that their engineering or their
yes.
drawing.
Interestingly, I don't find that an artistic question. In other words, I think it's not a question about art. It's not an artistic question. It is a question before the artistic questions. It is a philosophical question about agency, and let's call, in an old way, you could say subjectivity. So, hold that. And I don't have a full answer anyway. I don't have an answer. But what is
I think Juliet might just have articulated at the end of that of what you said there, something that you said last night about dOCUMENTA itself, which was that it tried to set up circumstances that are readable by art.
Yes.
Or that certain works were things that were readable by art. So maybe that's to do with the question before art again.
Yes, well, that your answer. Do I have to speak in that? No, I don't have to. I have this thing. I think what Alison is saying is answering the question by saying that I didn't say it was art, but I said the same thing that you are saying, which is that it can be read by artists or brought into the context of art. But I was not making that statement. The question is correct because that statement is quoted concerning what is dOCUMENTA 13. Mm-hmm. For example, Anton Zellinger doing his quantum physics experiment, or Enrique Villamatas writing a text in the restaurant in the Aue Park. So, or visiting Breitenau, Gedenkstätte, Memorial, so on. So I was speaking about the project of dOCUMENTA as not 13, as not necessarily only containing things that one would define as art. Mm-hmm. The question that you ask here is a more, that your name is? Juliet asks, is a more specific question. Is you last night said that the termite skyscraper is, I blurred between art and architecture. So there is a question still to be asked.
Yes,
yeah, there is a
is,
question.
Yeah.
And there are many of us here that probably have some thoughts on it. But what I can throw into the mix right now is, I also last night said, and I thought you were going to quote it, Adorno, who says that art is always that which it no longer is, in a way, that once it is defined, it is already somehow no longer that. And that art has this particular way of slipping away, always. Otherwise it becomes academic repetition of older formats or ideas of what it is. And without going to that, without going to Adorno, which in any case is also situated historically and politically in the mid-20th century School of Frankfurt, his negative dialectics, his way of always wanting to question the premises of whatever thought and criticality you're performing towards something in the world, which is the process of negative dialectics. So beyond that, we can also go back to a few other people, and in particular Ernst Gombrich, you know, who wrote this incredible history of art that you've probably all read at university or at school in 1951. And he also writes at the beginning of the story of art. I didn't read it last night. It's one of the things that I had to cut out for reasons of time. But he wrote that, quote, "There is no such thing as art. There are only artists. Once these were men who took colored earth and roughed out the forms of a bison on the wall of a cave. Today, some buy their paints and design posters for hoardings." I think he was referring to capitalism. "There is no harm in calling all these activities art, as long as we keep in mind that such a word may mean very different things in different times and places, and as long as we realize that art with a capital A has no existence." Now, that's Ernst Gombrich at the beginning of the story of art. So quite something, which is forgotten nowadays, because we live in a very academic period where we apparently, in the art community, are very radical and open and so on. But I think there is a really strong legacy of the notion of the autonomy of art in today's artistic practice, even when it is defined as not autonomous, like in activist art projects. It's always activist art projects vis-a-vis non-activist art projects, vis-a-vis this thing defined in the Enlightenment as art. So one of the processes of a lecture like last night is simply to bring us back to a more open way of thinking than the one that we're actually usually steeped in art schools or art university courses or art world, gallery exhibitions, museum exhibitions, where we take for granted a certain a priori, which is a modern a priori definition of art. And that brings me to reading the text of Alfred Gell, but it also brings me to reading the text of Andrew Yang, who is a young artist who studied biology and teaches teaches science at the Art Institute of Chicago as his day job, because he happens to be a biologist, but he's also an artist. And so I asked him to think about that question. He's written a number of things that you can find on the internet. And I asked him, listen, take Kant's definition of what is art and write a paper that, if I was still doing dOCUMENTA, it would have become a notebook. But I wasn't doing dOCUMENTA, so I just asked him to write it. And because I have this kind of habit of asking people, why don't you just write that for me or think about it? And it's a paper that hopefully will be published sometime, but it isn't published yet. And you have it in your reader. So he took the sentences of Kant, which in the critique of judgment, you only have one part of the critique of judgment in your text, but it is the one where he speaks of he says, by right we ought only to describe as art production through freedom, i.e. through a will that places reason at the basis of its actions. For although we like to call the product of bees regularly built cells of wax a work of art, this is only by way of analogy, analogy with our own architecture and art. As soon as we feel that this work of theirs is based on no proper rational deliberation, we say that it is a product of nature, of instinct. So this is a very interesting text to think about. The other text where he speaks about art is when he speaks about the genius. So the genius is basically he or she, for him it's a he, who obviously, who is able to imitate that beauty of nature, to imitate that purposeful and instinctual activity that makes these forms out in the world that we see as beautiful, and yet imitate it with purposelessness. So it is a kind of simulacrum of purposefulness in making form. And the genius is he or she who has that ability to make this apparent unintentional, this intentional useless thing. Okay, but that text is not here. But if we look at this text, which Gombrich obviously doesn't agree with, because in 1950 he's saying at the beginning of the story of art, I repeat, there is no such thing as art, there are only artists. Once there were men who took colored earth and roughed out the forms of a bison on the wall of a cave. Today some buy their paints and design posters for hoardings. There is no harm in calling all these activities art, as long as we keep in mind that such a word may mean very different things in different times and places, and as long as we realize that art with a capital A has no existence. But what Gombrich does add a few lines later, which would agree with your position, which actually is an a priori just for the purpose of writing that book, is, quote, objects made by human beings for human beings. Okay, so that's a pretty broad, we can put in a computer into that as well, a laptop and a smartphone. we can put almost anything that we make into that. Objects made by human beings for human beings. I continue with Gombrich. If we take art to mean such activities as building temples and houses, making pictures and sculptures, or weaving patterns, there is no people in all the world without art. So, Gombrich is saying, I'm going to make it broader than what Kant did, because he is saying that his definition of art is not necessarily purposelessness, not useful. So you can bring dance, you can bring building houses, sculptures and temples all under the same rubric. If, on the other hand, we mean art some kind of beautiful luxury, something to enjoy in museums and exhibitions, or something special to use as a precious decoration in the best parlor, we must realize that this use of the word is only very recent development, and that many of the greatest builders, painters and sculptors of the past never dreamed of it, which is what I always say. So if we want to use, he's kind of almost critiquing, but in a subtle way, Kant, because he's saying beautiful luxury, something to enjoy in museums and exhibitions. That would be a Duchampian definition of art in a way. You know, the fact that you name it as art makes it art. So it's in the exhibition or in the museum, and therefore art museum, and therefore it's art. So we can put anything under that rubric as long as we define it as art. We, meaning the human subjects. Or something special to use as a precious decoration in the best parlor. So to use, so he's saying to use. So decoration would be purposelessness, a beautiful luxury, the Kantian thing, but to use, so this object has a purpose and a use in terms of the aesthetic use, the use of the aesthetic in our daily lives. And that would be a broadening up to also Islamic patterning, carpets and architecture, decoration on architecture. So Gombrich reminds us that the notion of the autonomy of art is very recent and only since the Enlightenment. Most of what we see as artworks from the past were objects which had a definite function. This is just me writing the talk for yesterday. Sometimes it is what we today would call a magic function. So that would be an anthropological, human anthropological definition of art in a pre-modern era. It would be magic function. If we want to look into the Western society, we don't call it a magic function, we call it a religious function, because we don't want to say that religion in the West was a form of magic, or we don't want to say that magic in the non-West is a form of religion, or we don't usually do that. We like to call one thing magic and the other religio, but it doesn't really mean much different. It's following a number of rules for the attainment of some transformation of the world. But when you define something as magic, you're almost using an external definition to diminish it as some sort of superstition. Whereas if you're within the culture or the sphere or the moment of magic, you would never use such a diminutory term. You would just say, I'm transforming the world, as a chemist might say, I'm transforming the world in a lab, in a Western lab. So anyway, that's the anthropological gaze on the pre-modern stuff that people make, using an expanded sense of people. Okay, sometimes it is what we today would call a magic function. We today, meaning a man in the 1950s in the West reading anthropology, like when an image is painted for protection. There is guesswork about why prehistoric cavemen painted on ways, in those ways deep in caverns, far from the light. It could not be decoration. They were parts of rituals of some sort. And Hauser, Arnold Hauser, just to move to another person who writes about art from, in this case, from a more sociological perspective, in relation to the social and economic developments of history in particular. He also sees this art in the service of life, quote unquote, in the service of life, that it was not decorative and that its purpose was, quote, magical, not aesthetic. But he questions and wonders about the handprints that are on the caves, older than the representations, and that seem playful, because the possibility of play would somehow question this magical and not aesthetic question. But all of these are thoughts in the brains of art historians. They are not what we don't know. We're not with, but we don't even know what's going on down the street in the brain of an artist. I mean, it's difficult to actually make claims. Sometimes we don't know even if we are an artist in ourselves, you know, so these claims. Anyway, this is not an answer to your question, but it's a beginning of an answer, of a discussion. And to go back to Kant then, I think it's interesting to read it, you know. By right, we ought only to describe as art, by right. So he's using an Enlightenment term, right, you know, that there is a right. By right, we ought only to describe as art production through freedom. So the use of the word production is interesting, and the use of the word freedom, because this is a historical period in which there is a conscious discourse being structured around freedom, which is, however, contingent on the non-freedom of the whole, to use an Adornian term, you know, the non-freedom of the whole that is described in the dialectic of enlightenment. The non-freedom of the whole is not only other peoples during the developments of colonialism, but it's also the control over so-called nature through the sciences, the classification systems of the Enlightenment, the nominations, the naming of the plants, the naming of the different elements, which is quite different from the making of penicillin later. So we're in a moment of unfreedom of the whole, which allows for this idealization of freedom. And it is similar to the unfreedom of the whole through nomination that we have today with, for example, genetics and neuroscience, where suddenly there is an obsession with nomination. You know, for example, why does mirror touch, I was speaking about it this morning, why does mirror touch, why do mirror neurons, okay, this is a very recent term, mirror neurons, it's I think 1980s or 90s, coined by these neuroscientists in Parma. It doesn't mean that there was no empathy before. If I see you hurting, bleeding, I will feel pain if I'm not anesthetized by seeing too many people that are bleeding, in which case other neurological things occur for the protection of the self to decrease empathy. Which is why people, for example, who are synesthetes with very strong mirror touch abilities, they will start to close down, you know, to not look. And there are sometimes forms of autism because it's ways of balancing this increased perceptiveness. But why in the world would we think that somehow mirror neurons is a discovery of anything? It isn't a discovery of anything. It's just a photograph of the place in the brain where this empathy occurs. But by naming it mirror neuron, by naming the plant, you're actually somehow creating this unfreedom of the whole. And it also is successful because it has the word mirror in it. If you didn't call it mirror neuron, if you had called it repetition neuron, it would not have been successful in popular culture, in newspapers, in media. But it is a magic. I mean, if you want to anthropologically look at it, there's magic going on by calling it mirror neuron, because mirror evokes the image, the reflection, the self, Lacan, 100,000 things, Narcissus. So there is an unfreedom of the whole today in genetically mapping the genomes of all the plants that is similar to the unfreedom of the whole at the time when Kant speaks about art as this space of freedom. So it's complicated to accept such an idea of autonomy of art today.
So when he's talking about that, he's talking about the free play of the imagination.
Yes.
And
whatever that means. What does that mean? Could you explain what that means?
Well, he talks about that as being a fundamental cognitive faculty.
Mm-hmm.
You know, actually, without the imagination, you can't think. And I was just remembering those bits in the Critique of Judgment when he's talking about imitation. And genius is about imitation with imperfection.
Imitation without purpose, in a way.
Without purpose, but to simply copy the beauty of nature.
Oh, yeah. It's not great art, yes.
It has to bear the marks of an imperfection for it to be other.
Mm-hmm.
And
That's true. That's very interesting to remind us of that.
And then I guess the bits, there are the bits where he talks about the nightingale. Is it the nightingale?
I don't remember.
He says about, you know...
Do you have the text?
I
here?
don't have the text with me. No, not the whole of the Critique of... Oh,
No, but I have an excerpt. I bring all these suitcases, so it's longer than this little thing here. So it might be.
But there's a bit where he talks about...
I mean, obviously it's longer, but that is the excerpts where he speaks about genius and art. And
But the singing of the nightingale, which he says is, I think he says it's one of the most beautiful things in nature. And then the vulgarity of the person who comes along to create a mechanical bird to copy the sound, which is kind of leads him to the journey towards making that distinction. I think that you've been articulating
of genius
about the play of the imagination, and obviously from a human-centered perspective. But maybe what we've been thinking about with the examples that you were showing yesterday, there is a play of the imagination there that is not familiar to our understanding of that, you know, that kind of enlightened perception.
That's very interesting. I mean, because that brings me to reading Natasha Myers and Hustak, which you have, because most of the science studies feminists who are trying to argue for creativity in non-humans, they use this word, creativity in non-humans, are actually using as a definition of art this idea that there is this play of the imagination. But this can, to answer her question, I mean, being an Adornian, I don't think art is identified with necessarily the play of the imagination, nor is it identified with innovation, which is the imperfection that makes it not a copy, which is the beginning, the birth of the idea of originality as a value, as opposed to copying well as a value, which would be a Renaissance idea of art more than changing. It would be some sort of achieving something close to something in the past, which is perfect. So it's so it's interesting that most of the science studies feminists take for granted that we would define, we coming from the artistic community, would define art as related to a play of the imagination and to play, which is actually not a given at all, but also a culturally dependent, situated, historically determined concept, which, for example, if we read Alfred Gell, has nothing to do with, or not necessarily to do with the technologies of enchantment, where it has re-enchanting technologies, which is a kind of Latour thing. We have to also read Latour, would be, I mean, I don't have an answer, but I think that I'm just trying to say that that you've added something, which is the play of the imagination. But I don't think anybody in the art world would say that that's a definition of art right now, necessarily. Nor can we say that it is, because it's contingent on subjectivity of a single subject. So there would be no artist in an Arab Islamic tradition of patterning then, you know. So again, we're going back to this Eurocentric idea that for it to be art, it has to be made by a subject. But I did play with that, individual subject. I did play with that yesterday when I told you that the bowerbirds have different styles. One likes red and the other likes blue, and then they compete for who's going to get a mate. And there's something which is innate, but there's also something which is learned and acquired over the years of not being really good at it. So there's something between craft and imagination that is balanced in the learning process of the bowerbirds. So what? So we were just reading this thing through a will. So the freedom question. So freedom would be this idealization of an external, of a context within which free will could be exercised, which is something parallel to this free play of the imagination. But at the same time, when he says that places reason at the basis of its actions, there has to be this intentionality for it to be art. So I think that, I don't think really much more than saying that if you want to define artistic practice as Gombrich, objects made by human beings for human beings, no, but if we want to, we can do that for the purpose of not going crazy. So we have to divide the different faculties at the university, we have to divide the fields up, we have to study something. So we decide, okay, we're going to cut this little world out and be in it. And that's fine, but it isn't a priori. So that's why gel is important. I mean, it's important to realize that we are accepting an a priori, the same way a sociologist is accepting an a priori when they decide to be sociologists, because they are deciding to study only societies of humans, even though in relation to the world at large, materials, historical determinations of various sorts, geographical, geological, climactic.
Sociologists are studying human-animal relations.
Yes, that's an a priori. So if it's an a priori, I mean, it is now, the question would be, is it interesting to study, for example, human, non-human societies? There are people who do that, obviously. Not so, I mean, more coming from ethology, but coming really from, again, I would say feminist science studies a lot, like Vinciane Després, studying the relations between the animals and their owners, or the animals in labs and the scientists. So there are a number of cross-disciplinary sociologists that are broader, that have decided to, you know, what are the interactions between rats and people in cities, and the livelihoods of pigeons and people and insects, and they're coming from biology also, you know, or actually, you know, one of the biggest, broadest fields for that, actually, those intra-studies in that field, which I'm sort of arguing for from the artistic field, but in the other one, the sociology, let's say, is agronomy. If you look at the faculties of agronomy around the world, I was just looking at Parma the other day, because my daughter is trying to figure out where she wants to enroll. And it's quite amazing that agronomy is one of the few departments where right now you have science courses, you know, you have chemistry, biology, physics, and then you have art history, history, a lot of history, well, history of food, obviously, and taste. But so something between the sciences and the human sciences, the non-human and the human sciences, because that's when you're in the front line of agriculture today, how can you think of it without thinking about how people live in the world, how they migrate, where they live, where they choose to live, who they choose to live with, how social conditions and merging and hybridizations of different food traditions occur, and how Monsanto is dealing with things, how the flattening of... that's one of the areas where you could say a kind of expanded field of sociology is occurring, is in the agronomy departments nowadays. And it's interesting that a young girl like my daughter, 17, without me saying, well, where do you want to go to school? She said, well, maybe I'll go to agronomy. And I said, why? She says, because I can't figure out if I want to study physics or Islamic art. And I said, what the hell do those two have to do with it? And then I thought about it, and I thought about Laura Marx, who wrote this book that just came out about the line and about the line and patterning, and how she actually does take from both physics and from the history of the line as a mark making, and sees the line neither representation nor abstraction as, or the battle between those, what came first in art history, the figurative cave paintings or the pattern, but she sees the line as actually a possible trajectory, and connecting string figures and Islamic patterning and so on. So I thought, well, why not? So maybe what I'm trying to do is paradoxical, but it's to encourage, very superficially because I don't really know anything at all, but dabbling in a few things, very superficially, trying to encourage that also in the arts we might have a look at what happens if we expand the field a little bit. So it's more a tool.
You've just said what I was going to say. Did you see art as something that is a sort of a holding ground again for relationships between these disciplines in a way? Because that's how some artists are beginning to think about what they do, isn't it? In a sense, it's a discipline that isn't a discipline anymore in one sense. Because the field of art has opened up some... I mean, when you come to teach it, it's actually very difficult to teach now.
Yes.
Because you don't know what it is that you're teaching any longer.
Yes, you can't even go into anti-art like avant-garde, Peter Berger.
Not. No, that's all gone. So in a sense, it is this field that you... Well, it is.
Yes, I agree with you. It's all gone.
So it's this field that you somehow have to keep open as a space in which one can discuss some of these things.
Yes, but
something has to be made.
But I want to say something else humbling, just for a moment. That would almost lead us to thinking that the amateur nature of the artistic field, in the good sense of the term amateur, amatore, to love, like Sophia, is some sort of privileged context where we can be amateurs. But I don't really think that either, because this feeling that you're feeling,
it is a feeling that I'm feeling.
This feeling that you're feeling in the arts, this bubbling thing of what to do with this expanded field, 50 years after Adorno says that art is no longer that which it was when it's defined, and after Gombrich is saying 60 years after Gombrich is saying art doesn't exist, only artists exist, one might think that we are privileged, but actually it's bubbling everywhere. That's it's bubbling everywhere. If you go into physics departments, they want to introduce philosophy courses, maybe. They don't know what to do.
But I don't think it's privileged, because we still have to teach it. In one sense, it's a puzzle now, because I'm not talking about anything that is amateur.
No, but amateur in the good sense, I mean.
Yes, amateur in the good sense, but, in the sense of the professionalized world of the art and the artist, what students expect when they walk into a school of art and design.
Yeah, but we're not going to do that, though.
No.
I don't want to go in that direction, because then we go into a sociological question of what artists expect.
But you were talking about disciplinary categories.
Yes.
So I'm talking about that in the context in which you were talking about disciplinary categories, because we still have to teach it as a disciplinary category, which in a sense is now drawing from, or our students are drawing from, whether they know it or not, all sorts of other disciplines.
Yes. I agree. It's a pertinent question. It's a very pertinent question. The only way that I agree, so
It's an observation rather than a question, actually. It's an observation that I think anybody who is teaching in a School of Art and Design now is either being pushed towards commercialization and functional
yes, that's
design.
where I wanted to go. Yes.
Okay, functional design, or we're being left in this intersecting world of ideas, which students are picking up from all sorts of areas, like your daughter. Okay, which we now don't know what to do with, in a sense of what we used to do was create, you know, professional artists, or what is a professional art. I mean, in Britain, particularly with the YBA movement, we were producing people who had this profession called artists who made money out of it.
Yes, there are two things that are produced, I think, usually. One is craft, a kind of how to make a print, how to make a fiberglass cast, how to, because the YBAs, but not only, there was a need for some sort of material works, physically visible works, just to be very silly about it, but also just for market purposes or whatever, after the waning of the conceptual art period. But it wasn't only that. So one aspect that was being trained is this ability to make things, the craft of traditional crafts, sculpture, painting, how you prime a canvas, and foreground and background and shading and the whole thing. And the other thing that was being produced, which I put on the same level as that, I don't think it's more free or more radical, is the ability to imagine, which is a faculty needed in creative works like advertising and mostly in communications for product development, capitalist selling. Product packaging and product to create the desires in other people. So the exercising of the faculty of conceptual imagination was being exercised. To train to think up artwork. You know, the artwork is, I'm going to go down the street, and a sort of application of de Certeau to capitalism. I'm going to use this object in a useless way, in a different way. I'm going to, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask 10 people, you know, to write their thoughts on a piece of paper and then put the piece of paper on the wall. Or, I mean, I'm not an artist, so I can't come up with an artwork like that. But the artwork as a kind of in a little PDF.
Or, on the other hand, it was handed over to the fabricators.
Yes, but when it's handed over to fabricators, it's because you're privileging this artistic project, the proposal, you know, the Olafur Eliasson concept. I'm going to make a big sun, and it's going to be like bringing inside the turbine hall, and everybody's going to relax and rest. That's the artwork, and then you hand it over to fabricators.
I was thinking about the Damien Hirst piece, actually.
Oh, Damien Hirst also. It's the concept that is handed over to fabricators.
Can we bring this conversation back?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
I'm not entirely convinced, though, that artists, and especially many of the contemporaries that I work with, are that kind of engaged with it or worried about the idea of making art, and they would like to think that they would like to be even maybe in their studio, like plugging a hole there, working out, or say Olafur Eliasson is like trying to make a huge sun, and then later on down the line that's kind of becoming art. But at the same time, so there's this kind of disavowal of the fact that we all know what art looks like. We've been to art school and we've kind of been to many art museums, but we just want to worry about making the object in our studio. But at the same time, we're kind of there's a proximity, and we're positioning ourselves near to things like outsider art, which is seems to be so present. Like for instance, particularly at Venice, and as the kind of Massimo, kind of the generation of artists are all putting themselves next to the outsider artists. And when we're talking about kind of fields and kind of practitioners.
Yes, I have so much to say about that question, but I don't know if it's the moment to say it.
We need to think about, because actually.
Well, I don't know if we really need to, because I need to cut you off for a second, because what Griselda just did is cut us off for a second, and it's not bad to focus on something, because one of the problems of the superficiality of our times is that we're always discussing what's so-called topical. So now we're supposed to be discussing outsider art, and it can sway into here where we're, yesterday we were talking about beaver dams, which is, or we were trying to look at Kant's definition of art and trying to answer this one question somehow. If we are swayed immediately into the topical subjects of the here and now moment of this year's season, it is not exactly a space of freedom. I mean, I see it as the same
line of questioning though. Like, if we're trying to kind of co-opt the beaver or bring the beaver in, like, isn't that not the same thing that we're trying to do with
Okay, let's go there then. Okay, if we want, but we're only going to go there for a little bit, because then I think we really have to look at art and read some text. But let's go there. No, let's go there a little bit. Let's go there a little bit. But because I'm afraid we just go into these salotto discourses, discussions, living room, after dinner discussions, which because it's so huge. I mean, everybody's talking about the outsider art after Massimiliano Gioni did his Biennale of Venice. That's ridiculous, because there's a museum of art brut in Lausanne. Dubuffet was collecting art brut. Lynn Cook has been researching.
Zeeman put it into dOCUMENTA 5.
Zeeman had so much in the... so what I think was the operation in Venice was an operation like the one we spoke about in genetic classification, nominating something in order to somehow have power over it or use it as an object in itself.
Absolutely.
So, so number one, and to be honest, there was a hell of so-called outsider art also in dOCUMENTA 13, so-called outsider art. First, we don't even know what outsider art means, because people use the term in different ways. Outsider art might mean not academically trained. That's how Lynn Cook uses it. Outsider art, I mean not trained as an artist, outsider. But if you use it as not trained as an artist, and then you realize that Michelangelo Pistoletto was not trained as an artist, you get into trouble with that definition of outsider. Outsider art as the mentally handicapped, or differently able people, how do you say in, people with psychiatric therapy or not therapy who do... The anguished, the traumatized, the people who have expressed themselves without necessarily saying or nominating it as art practice, but it's just a way of automatic writing or automatic drawing. There's more. I mean, we can go to more definitions of outsider art, but let's not do that. What I think the problem with nominating it as a model for art, in a way, is that it becomes almost a market element, to say, and it allows for a certain connoisseurship of outsider art after having been in the connoisseurship of so-called insider art. So it's very problematic what's going on with this obsession of outsider art. But what you bring up is interesting, and I think the main reason, please correct me if I'm wrong, the main reason you're bringing this up is because of the question of the we. So when I spoke about Tristan Garcia and the 4 types of we that he speaks about, you could see this expansion of the so-called art world or art field to include the marginalized figures amongst the humans, and then to include the non-human as well. Animals, and then to include the non-human, not organic life, so the inanimate objects, the stones and rocks. And then at that point you're in cosmology and spirituality and in basically, I don't know, tantra or something. So you could say that. And in that sense, we can critique this attitude, of course. Before the outsider art would have come within this diabolic plan, multiculturalism, so to expand from the Eurocentric to the non-Western art, you could see it as a kind of progressive expansion and inclusivity, which could be seen as some sort of diabolical project of bringing everything under this heading of something very Western and very modern. You could, but what do we do with this idea that you have? Is that a reason to go back to a traditional closure onto subjectivity and Kant, actually pre-Kant? Is that a good reason to, I mean, is that, or does it have to do, like with psychoanalysis, with what use things are put to? What is the use that you make of something? You can use certain tools that you've acquired through psychoanalysis to become an authoritarian leader of some society, because you can manipulate people very easily, or you can use it for other personal purposes of self-liberation and so on. So the use to which things are put, I think, are more important than defining them as in themselves good or bad.
I want to make, can I just make a little bit of an intervention just to bring us, because from the actual lecture, obviously this question of from archive to compost, and the kind of the compostitional as the propositional was what you talked about last time, and then we got the compostitional, etc. I'm just wondering, if we could just maybe for everybody, what's at stake, and I think we've begun to lay out something of stake in terms of certain kinds of practices, certain kinds of ways of thinking. But so I want to just put on the table a couple of things. One is, if it's a matter of how we say what stories we tell, right? We could tell a story called life and form, and that everything, therefore, that is, life, even if it was life and now is no longer life, like sort of rocks in one sense, there's certain kinds of things, and there are therefore certain elements of life and form, right? So we could set up something called transspecies studies, which are concerned with anything that is to do with
nice.
The kind of
transspecies studies.
This kind of sort of the certain kinds of energies and certain kinds of formulations. Okay, now that would function for what you were trying to do, which is that we are in a process of deeply interrogating the benefits and the problems of a Western tradition. There's no doubt that's what's on the stake, which is not kill the Westerners, as the sort of jihadists want us to do, but simply it had its contradictions, and we have to evaluate. So we have to have a critique.
Modern Western tradition.
Modern
That's
Western.
why
Okay,
I
it's
told.
the modern. Well, what we call the Western tradition tends to be the modern. Okay, but right, we'll clarify
but
that.
That's important.
But so if we are dealing, and that's why I thought the Mary Wollstonecraft text was very interesting about this sequences, because a lot of it, what we were doing was looking at analogies and analogies of analogies, but this, and anybody who came to the Brian Shert thing, this metaphorical thinking.
Yes.
So whether you think with the figure of the Jew or the black, you can now think with the figure of the bee or the beaver or the life form or the bacteria. We are still in metaphorical thinking, although we ground it. But anyway, if we're displacing centrism, we're looking at certain fundamental questions of self-other, which obviously are part and parcel of the process of trying to define what constitutes the human. So what we know is when anybody tried to constitute the human, they constituted the definition of the human in terms of the normalization of who was doing the constituting at the time.
Yes.
So it sort of tended to be, the white European man took him or himself as the point. So it seems to me two things are going on. In transspecies studies, what you're trying to make us out is part and parcel of the radical decolonization of the mind. Absolutely, you have to imagine the world, and I think, therefore, imagining the world from the point of view of the animal going to the abattoir, or the horse who can count, or the bee that's dancing. This does not suddenly make us go, as you say, we just exclude everything, and everything is art, and nothing is differentiationable, because there can be no knowledge if we can't make some kind of differentiations. Now, I'm going to throw in the Darwinian thing. Okay, the one thing Darwin could not explain, as I understand it, and he said he couldn't work it out, is why the evolutionary project did not arrive at sort of greyness. right? Because if everybody's adapting to whatever they have to adapt to, etc., and only the ones that survive, why do we have diversity? So it was only when they discovered random mutation that you realized there was just this something that just went off. And that's why we have what we have. It is not everything like mixed paint getting grayer and grayer, but absolutely the extraordinary diversity. And the second thing he didn't arrive at, I mean, this is not to negate him, but the limitations of his moment, was what they now study, which is the expression of the genes. That you can have absolutely the same genes, but they express themselves in ways. So a grasshopper and a locust are absolutely genetically identical, whereas one hangs around on its own on a blade of grass and the other swarms. Okay, now you could try all sorts of explanations which they come, on the basis of it, but that's the feature, which is the expression. And that seems to me where we come back to finding a way where you could still be engaged in the specification of what's human. And what we've used since Aristotle, which is either language or tool making, I mean, every possible area of research has shown that all of the claims for what makes the human animal different from animals is not unique.
No,
we've
but
lost that.
I don't think it's useful. My perspective is I don't think right now it's useful to want to figure out what's the human. That's because if you're using that, you're kind of
no. I'm going to put it on the table because
transspecies studies.
But that's we cannot imagine that we are in a position outside of our own situatedness as the form of animal we are to be the one who makes the sort of the knowledge systems. Yet at the same time, that is the fact. There is no way that the genes of the horses are expressing themselves in institutes on the question of horsiness and humanness. But that is what we're doing. And I mean, that doesn't make us the center of the universe, but it makes a form of expression of animal capacities that has something which, so in the move to decenter is a political move of enormous significance and transforms the way they think. But I'm sorry, I do remain, lodged in this slightly other space. That's why I just thought I'd throw in this as a kind of, an argument, a conversation which would set up this thing, because I don't think it's irrelevant, because for so long, most of the world amongst the human populations have actually struggled to be at least admitted even into the condition of the human. Now, we might say, well, forget it, dear, because you could be much happier, aligned with the horses and the bees and the beavers, which I think...
As many human societies lived.
Yeah.
I mean, many human societies did not live with the specification of the human, or including more or less into the human.
But, yeah.
You might well have covered this, but it just gave me lots of thoughts about an exhibition that I saw at the Media Museum, which was around...
Oh yeah, Iconoclash.
I can't remember what it was called, and I can't remember any of the artists, so that's not very useful. But it was basically, there was one particular photography exhibition, one particular artist who was working with gorillas, and actually sort of getting to know them and taking their portraits, so taking a portrait of a gorilla, but a specific individual gorilla, so to challenge the idea of when we think about, and one thing that hasn't been mentioned so far is we talk about beavers or bees, but we don't talk about an individual...
A relationship.
Yeah, a thing, an animal that exists as a person, as a person, yeah. And also,
well,
so
we
I suppose
did talk about it with Christina Buch.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's what I mean, you might, but I thought, obviously, there's this other problem because, again, you're kind of defining the relationship with the animal as you would with a human. So, like, you're kind of setting the terms of what this individual personality and subjectivity is, in a sense, if you know what I mean. Like,
yeah, I agree with you, actually. I think that it's important, but I wouldn't use those words.
Yeah.
I never say the animal and the human. I always say the non-human and the human animals. So it's just a language thing to go like...
but
Malcolm X said, don't say black sheep all the time. So I don't particularly use the word human and animal, but
Okay.
the content of what you say, I think, is correct. I mean, to stop seeing in categories the situation, but to see it also in the way that Vinciane Després is looking at specific relationships. This rat and that young student who just got into the lab is a way of also solving the problem that you bring up, because part of the problem is the abstraction of humanism, to speak in these abstract terms about the human and the non-human. I think, I mean, I agree with moving towards specific relations,
No, I mean,
rather than this abstract thing. Yeah.
just being open to the non-human animal and recognizing that we don't always set the terms and that our behavior is dependent on being open to non-human behavior, non-human intelligence, non-human knowledge. You know, and I think you're right about the specificity of the interaction.
I mean, to go back, I mean, there are many things that were brought up. I think this political pitfall that you bring is very important. Just to that, what was your name? Sam. That Sam brings up is a legitimate question. You know, the political pitfall of this expanding the inclusiveness and why. What's underneath it? What's underneath it? Of course, I think it's a subject to be discussed more. Your question is connecting with what Griselda says, actually. I think Griselda's last comment. But what you just, I mean, the connection between the first question and what Griselda is asking or commenting on or saying is crucial, actually. I mean, because when you are speaking, fundamentally we still hang on to this thing of what is the human. It may be less true if you're in, for example, a physics lab. Anton Zellinger doesn't ask himself from morning till night, what makes me human, what makes us human. He's quite embedded in the trying to figure out the photons entangled and why they're doing what they're doing. So if science is able to transform itself away from this belief in objective truth value of results, which still most scientists believe is necessary to their practice, and if most science is able to move closer to where quantum physics is, with its own self-inquiry constantly, then maybe the humbleness that there is in the sciences might filter into the human sciences, into art a little bit, so that we can suspend for a moment that question, which is important. Of course it's important what makes us human, but if we keep with that question, we're going to look at what the beavers are doing and so on, always premised with and steeped in a form of human exceptionalism, which is how can I
don't
Yes.
see that is a necessary logical conclusion
Okay.
of that. I mean, I'm trying to hold both the movement to the other side, but once you've made that movement, you return from that other space of trans-species studies to not exceptionalism, but specification, which allows us to recognize specific sets of activities of life and form and the expression of life through form. I think that's what I'm trying to point. But it still leaves us with some kind of self-consciousness. It's not to define what makes the human different from all the others and better than all the others, or whatever it is, but it is unique to the human situation, the human animal or human situation at this moment, to be engaging in this kind of activity. Right?
Yes, but
And
we
that
don't know
is-
what the self-consciousness is of
I know, but then
other
but
communities.
as far as we know, well, when we find, Beaver
Well, we
Universities,
can't find,
I
that's
will be
part of
very
the...
interested, but I don't think this makes it any better. It just means it becomes the problem of what's at stake for us in terms of doing this. That's what I'm just saying, because it alters it. But I've got so many questions. So,
Yes, let's...
Jenny was next.
There was just a Another addition that could be perhaps brought in, it was what Griselda reminded me of, why certain things can have the same genetic makeup but act totally differently, and that was the idea that was introduced by Susan, and I can't remember her second name sadly, and Richard Dawkins, about the idea of a meme.
Ah, yes.
An inherited gene of cultural things. So we tend to not to always think of one aspect of art, and as far as I know, it only occurs to me this cultural inheritance as being in the scientific world, if you like, or discipline, and I haven't heard it mentioned in the art world. Can you comment on that?
No. You mean like a kind of genetically inherited ability to draw or something?
Yes, but it's a cultural thing where we, and probably non-humans as well, there are elements of behaviour that aren't programmed in genes, but in some characteristic which is passed on.
Yes.
Which saves you going through the trials of Darwinism.
Starting all over. That's common to humans and non-humans.
Yeah.
Everyone, all beings of the world, even rocks. I mean,
yes.
The fact it's also physical properties. Like, for example, the stone doesn't have to learn to fall; it will fall.
Yeah,
so there are certain things that are not necessary. It's that the world is, that things are passed on from one time to another through history, through generation, through eons of time, that are not always learned from scratch again. We don't have to choose between nature and nurture, but that the nature-nurture divide is not so clear, and that gray zone is present in all sentient beings. Is that what you're thinking about?
It was just the phrasing of the use of the words like mirror neuron. They've always been there, but now it's named.
Ah, yes.
That sort of thing. Well, there's a naming of something called a meme, which is a cultural, that's what I was thinking of.
Yes.
A cultural inheritance that's specific.
My understanding of it as a biologist is that it is, and it's interesting because doing the reading for dOCUMENTA 13 module, the idea of the spread of Western culture to become the dominant and the universal just matches in with the concept of the meme, which is a packet of cultural practice which is transferred across different zones of different cultures. So I mean, it actually is an identical idea.
And about the humbleness of the sciences rather than the humanities and stuff. And I was, I just wanted to I was thinking around in my understanding of science studies being the I in the, or the we in the science. So perhaps the fact that the humanities do have this kind of subjectivity or genius or personal kind of element is actually should be the other way, should be going towards that in the sciences. Or is that in that's my understanding of it, that basically the lack of, or the supposed objectivity of the sciences is essentially the what science studies is trying to kind of undermine. So am I making sense? Like basically,
I don't understand exactly.
It sounded like you were sort of suggesting that science, the humbleness of the sciences, should be imposed more on the humanities rather than the other way around.
Indeed, there's a paradox, because one sees science as not humble at all, not self-critical and so on. But there's a paradox of the attention paid towards the human in the humanities exorbitant. Nowadays, it wasn't always like that. It was not like that actually so much before Kant. But after Kant and this birth of subjectivity, let's say, and subjective positions, until today, it has become very self-centered. So there is paradoxically a form of humbleness in just doing a study of plants or something. But what I mean, just to add on this question, this discussion between Griselda and myself actually now, I would say that I feel it as a blockage. I mean, the fact that we speak about reminding ourselves of this specificity of the human, having consciousness, critical consciousness, ethical consciousness, it is of course enormously important, because otherwise we can collapse into fascism, basically. You know, if we don't think ethically and constantly think about our responsibility in the world. But on the other hand, if we do that, it stops, and there's only so much time, and it stops us from doing other practices. For example, once we have decided that we're going to go beyond the stumbling block of whether the termite is a skyscraper or not, the home, we can then spend time studying the styles and evolutions and differences of all the we can write 20 books on the termite architecture, because it will allow us to free ourselves to then pay attention to that and start to study. Have they changed over history? Do they change in different climates? What are are there migrations of style from one place to another? So there is so much work to be done in the civilizations of non-humans, and if we leave that work only to the ethologists who study termites, who have no knowledge of, for example, all that we can bring to those trans-species studies of history of how human communities have built their homes and houses and dwellings, we can bring so much that can be meeting with those, and we can actually open up studies. You know, if we leave the bee dance to the ethologists, we can study surely some aspects of the symbolic language of bees very well. But if we bring that together with linguists and with people who work in literature and poetry, we might begin to see things or focus on things maybe that are closer to Keats. You know, in moments of bee dances that are not even observed. They're observed by scientists as random mutations. And maybe by trans-species studies can open up, maybe it's not random mutation. Actually, you know, Lynn Margulis, part of her whole point of endosymbiotic theory is that much of what Darwin saw or a traditional evolutionary thought science thinks of as random mutations are actually these moments where suddenly a number of individuals decide to collaborate to problem solve. And so they don't see it as random mutations, but as forms of creative problem solving in evolution, as opposed to... So it is our perspectives that can be lent to these other studies and enrich them, and those studies' perspectives that can be lent to our studies and can enrich them. This is what, if we can go beyond the stumbling block of saying, is it art or not? Because we don't even know what art is.
What I was trying to say is that that we need to remember that the individual who's doing the thing, who's observing the thing, is also creating the thing as well. You know, not just
the scientist.
Yeah, so which I think is, you know, the forgotten bit.
It seems to me that what you might be touching on is the question of meaning, because I was thinking last night that in art history, we can write about art and it doesn't depend. The meaning of art doesn't depend on the intention of the artist, and we can look at the forms, things that animals or non-humans make, and we can say in one way that we can consider this as art, or we can read it as art because we can understand that it is an intentional production. And I suppose I was wondering, where does that leave the question of meaning? How, and perhaps it's a question of, for me anyway, of art writing, how do we then incorporate the writing of things that perhaps we wouldn't have written about in the past into the discourse of art.
You're saying that last night I was saying that there is intention, but that we're not recognizing the intention. That was a way of saying that Kant was wrong, because there is clearly intention in the bees, and there's clearly reasoning, and there's clearly also so-called higher forms of consciousness in reparation of things, repairing things, or in planning to solve a water problem in advance of the water actually coming, and collaborating to plan and make that happen. So by saying that there's intention, it was like saying that there is that intention that Kant was talking about, so that it is not unintentional. But that doesn't mean that the meaning of the work is in the intention, neither for humans nor for non-humans.
Yeah, I suppose I was thinking that when we recognise what you've been talking about, what does that kind of mean for us?
Okay, that's a good. So I think that we have to say something now about this briefly, and then maybe read a little bit about speculative fabulation. What does it mean for us? I think that bringing this into the discussion is also has a use value. Let's say the use is to open up the sphere of discussion that's going on in art right now. So that is one level of the question. You know, when we say what stories do we tell so that other stories will be told, it means that if I tell a certain story, you know, if 100 artists do artworks on a certain area or field, whether intentionally or not, and we, for example, tell a story of critique of global financial capitalism through a number of art projects that have to do with money and eating money, or I'm just imagining, you know, we are telling stories so that other stories may be told, because the one thing about art history also is that, and this is kind of true everywhere, is that art and artists respond to other art and artists through the centuries and through time. It's like this conversation going on, even if they're not individuals, like if they're a style or a period of architecture. So that not only art can tell stories so that other stories can be told and change the directions of the imaginary systems of a certain period, epoch, place, and therefore change the politics. For example, Goya, with the disasters of war, changes the imaginary system around war. This is not heroic, it's a kind of collateral damage, something you don't want to do, but sometimes happens. And it is an element in the demise of a certain story that's told, of heroism in monuments, and it's the beginning of other stories that are told that end up in also political consequences, even though they didn't stop the wars from happening, but they certainly changed the way that societies in the West, at least, have seen war. So, but not only do artists change through the stories that they tell, the stories that will be told, also in the field of theory and art and critical studies and art history and so on, one can decide to tell other stories so that other stories can be told, both in culture at large, in art, in politics, so on. So if we want to tell the story of the architecture of the history of the architecture of bees, you know, we have to go millions of years back to the becoming vegetarian of these insects that were like wasps. They were not vegetarian. And then the need to collect nectar because you don't have enough sugar, you don't have enough proteins unless you can't be a hunter-gatherer if you're not a carnivorous animal. So this causes a big shift, is like when we tell about Mesopotamia and civilization starting with agriculture and therefore architecture and so on, and therefore art according to the Western story of art.
We can tell the story of architecture and urbanization happening with the shift from vegetarianism from carnivorous to vegetarian in honeybee, which occurred in the central plains of Russia somewhere and then slowly expanded around the world very recently to certain parts of the world. And we can say that because of that civilization shift, there was the birth of a certain kind of architecture, a shift in the architecture, which is the honeybee homes, which are very different, as I showed you in those pictures yesterday, from the wasp homes that don't have this storage requirements. And of course, therefore, creates the necessity for these modules, but also creates most of the flowers in the world. Because had there not been this shift, there would not be pollination through bees. There would only be pollination through wind. So we would have certain plants, but we wouldn't have other plants. And most of the flowers of the world we wouldn't have. So suddenly there's this co-evolution of forms of architecture, forms of so-called nature, forms of interspecies evolutions that can be read through the lens of what we know about, for example, the history of human civilization, one particular species, not because we are anthropomorphizing these entities, but because read through our lens, we can, or through the knowledges that we've accumulated over the centuries, we can actually bring those knowledges to then see that universe more, it comes from what you're saying, more striated, more complex, less simple. You know, bees do this and bees do that. And we can see all the specificities, the complexities, the uniquenesses of certain conditions and places and so on. And we can tell those stories in ways that then comes back to, that's what you're saying, comes back to maybe our imaginations of our own pots and pans and houses and sculptures and poems and lives that changes or affects our world. Also politically, I mean, we might end up not imposing from above certain environmental laws and rules, but we might from below, for example, imagine a world where growth is not a value, for example, per se. Economic growth is not a value, or building processes might not necessarily be a value. You know, there might be other values that are interesting that we learn from this companion species, kumpanis. So it can change life on the planet, you know. But if we have to think about this long-term question, we can get nowhere. You know, we have to actually pull up the sleeves and do the work, you know, do the work. Get together, if we want to, you know, get together with the bee experts, and you know things that she doesn't know, and she knows things that you don't know, and do the work, which is a small, small crumb in what stories do we want to tell so that other stories can be told. But it's political in the sense that it's a crumb for beyond our generation and many generations. Yeah. Does that answer your first question? I think, yeah, it's about the use that it's the use of doing these things. What's the point of doing them? Then this is just a portfolio of a young artist. So she's not a particularly mature artist. She's just starting out. She's a student. Do you remember I mentioned Rosemary Truckle yesterday, having said that all animals are female artists, which is an interesting perspective. Rosemary herself, if one were to, might bring that the next time, look at what she did with these ideas, is very interesting. Her exhibition, which was at the Serpentine Gallery last year, did anyone see that exhibition of Rosemary Truckle? It brought a lot of the so-called naturalia that she collected throughout the years, and that there was a lot of thinking between the forms that she made and the forms that a shell makes and so on in that exhibition, from a very personal perspective of Rosemary's work. But Christina Buch is the student of Rosemary Truckle. She just graduated the year of dOCUMENTA, so like your age in a way, a little bit, more or less. 10 years of exhibiting, maybe more, but young artist. So in this piece, which apparently it's one of her most recent pieces, and it doesn't look like it's about anything that has to do with non-humans at all. It's called Later Goliath, and then started humming. And she basically, the title is as if we caught the last sentence of David speaking to Goliath, but not as the Old Testament reports, she writes. Here's the picture of the piece. We hear a playful David, not announcing a fight. No, the witty child announces with settled yet humble confidence that the fight can wait, and that he, David, chooses to sing instead, maybe to hum and sing the seemingly invincible opponent out of the way instead of killing him, as he historically did. Historical note, David was an incredibly gifted musician. Anyway, this piece is a piece where the viewer is invited to lick the painting until it doesn't...
Is there instructions for the invitation? Or
yes. It says so in the label. It's edible cast candy and...
Oh, can we lick until gone?
Now, of course, this speaks to our fear of coevolution. I mean, in our age, everything is about sanitation and the fear of getting microbes that might hurt you. And so the last thing a museum will do is a project like this that would allow for a choice. It's like choosing to kiss or not kiss on the mouth someone. And yet, to be truthful, this artwork, which has been, I lost my glasses, this artwork, no, maybe I need these other ones, that has been, sorry, it comes after a series of other works that I'm going to show you, but this artwork that has been proposed many, many times and actually reviewed in Moose magazine, wrong glasses, I'm going to tell you a secret about the piece. It actually doesn't exist in the physical world because she hasn't been able to have a museum accept it. So she decided she would still make it and put it in the imaginary system. So the piece exists, but it hasn't actually existed. But she made an agreement with a number of art magazines, including Moose and Fries and others, I think, and not Fries, the German one, Kunst, whatever, Kunstforum, to have it reviewed. And so she's actually has the whole process of the work already done, but she does intend to, it only exists in one version in a collection, a private collection. And the Moose magazine says, painting and images in the broadest sense, the image we have of ourselves, of other humans, of other creatures, of God, or whatever else we can make an image of, can quickly become seemingly invincible as Goliath. An image of ourselves then faces another image that we have of whatever or whoever else, creating very often a situation of mutual auto-iconoclasm, the destruction of an image by an image. Why do we want to mutually undo the image? Perhaps because we sense that the image that we have of something or someone only obscures the real other, the real of ourself. The sense of discrepancy and inauthenticity drives us to undo or to attack the image again and again. What if we are called to not follow the rules of the image that we have of ourselves, to step out of our own image? For example, I do not lick art in order to undo the image that we have of another. Or what if we are so in love with the image of another, or perhaps even of ourselves, that we venerate it to its very own disappearance? The latter is the more commonly seen scenario. Religious people kiss rocks and icons over millennia until they might eventually disappear. Kaaba in Mecca, tombstone at Holy Sepulchre, Jerusalem, etc. Perhaps a life truly lived is one where most, if not all, images have been loved away. Or if they could not be loved, licked away, at least the holes created in the ceaseless attempts will allow us to get a glimpse of what lies beyond. Those were... This is actually the review. What you see on the wall is the review in Moose. When I first heard of the new project by the young and promising Christina Buch, my very first instinct was to climb my bookcase, reach onto the top shelf, and sweep the dust from iconoclash beyond the image wars in science, religion, and art. This is the exhibition that you're referring to, I think. No? No? Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Edited by Bruno Latour and Peter Weibel, the beautiful behemoth of a catalogue, so and so on. Do we need to... and so then the review compares with Janine Antoni, the 1993 piece of Lick and Lather, consisting of 14 self-portrait casts made in chocolate and soap that the artist modeled on classical busts. But those are not licked. They are licked, actually? Yeah, they are licked. Yes, they are licked. That's why it's being compared. So what does he say? They both address themes of intersubjectivity and transgression and play with the ambivalence between feelings of attraction and repulsion. Let's just go on to something earlier. So that's one of her newest projects that is stumbling to, the one that I just told you is stumbling to actually occur because of the health and safety things, which has to do with one of the reasons why we don't want to expand. I mean, the reason I brought it in was because it does have a lot to do with this fear of these invisible critters that inhabit our bodies that Donna Haraway always talks about, and the way that the whole society is keyed towards, sure, embracing environmentalism and everything, but packaging it and distancing it and seeing it from far and sanitizing all forms of contact. In Sol Marie Sits, in this other work, which was actually done in a gallery space last year after dOCUMENTA, it was a performative piece. That's Christina Buch up on the top preparing her pond with water, where her soul, of course, she always plays with words. Christina Buch, before studying with Rosemary Truckle, had gone to undergrad and studied theology and biology. So there you go. Theology, biology, and art. And so Sit Marie Sol is, of course, also play with words. It's the title is coming from Sit Marie Rose, which is a title of a novel by Etel Adnan. But of course, the soul as a fish, and the soul is part of it. And sit as a condition for women to stay put and sit. Don't move. In Sol Marie Sits, her title is Sol Marie Sits. A woman is not just killed again. No, this time a woman kills the female, the faulty and deformed image of a woman, as the weaker man, this is her words, that the patriarchal thought structures have woven into our society. Anyway, the project is that she goes to the sea and she fished a live soul. So she actually fished the fish in the sea, a flat fish. And she brought it to the gallery and put it in, prepared the space, built the tank, put the fish in the space, in the black rectangular pool with salt in it, which is correct water and salt for the soul to fish. And then on the day after, or a few days after, the Thursday evening, people gathered, and she basically cut out the cloth around her nipples, so it's referring, of course, to breastfeeding and to exhibitionism and to the female body and to her own body, is connecting with the fish's body. And then she took the fish out and boiled the fish and served the fish. Cut the fish, and the end of the whole performance was with her serving the broth. and her nipples visible, she connects with the eyes of the animal, non-human animal being killed to feed you. So this responsibility towards the gaze of the other. And she knows the text of Levinas because we discussed it. And she had also read Donna Haraway, Parting Bites. But the Levinas that the subject is instantiated in being the gaze, you encounter the gaze of the other who says, "Do not kill me." And in this moment, this ethical subject is constituted in not killing the other that appears in this visage. So in a way, she's problematizing that, because what if the other is actually killed? You know, what if the gaze is there and then there is this killing? And what is this occurrence of eating the other and sharing that eating and sharing living and dying together, and how we can somehow go beyond this hypocrisy of constantly killing and eating the other and yet denying it somehow through human exceptionalism, because we make that boundary with the human. So this is what she did. She also says in a note that there's a question about abortion in this piece. In this symbolic act of killing a fetus, in fact, is killed the future, but not biological, another envisioned, planned, and wished by man. So what is this possibility of seeing the question, for example, of abortion not from the perspective of a non-female body that decides on the livability or non-livability of whether the fetus is alive or not, as being an incorrect way of considering the choices that are made in doing an abortion or not. The murdered body. For her, here, the most important thing is that the detail that the murdered body is not thrown away. It's not an act of rejection which can be endlessly repeated. But here the body of the fetus is dissolved within warm liquid, penetrating every cell of the birth-giving body of the mother. So the fact of the eating of the broth of the fetus just killed in this externalized, visible uterus that's in the gallery space. So she's mother-child cannibalism is cannibalism of a lioness. Only the forces of that heights of degree are capable to realize such an event. She writes in a bit of a futuristic way, so we must interpret it. It is a myth about the sinking of curtains, a strongly willed end of a failed play, which appeared to be not about the wide open, but about the omnivorous obsession. Maybe man still has hope, woman not. So the omnivorous woman, the omnivorous obsession is somehow not denied, but faced and thought through in this piece. In many ways, I mean, what I like about her work is that you can't really say, this work says this and this and this. Her work is always very open, very ambivalent, very contradictory, very hard to make, in the sense that the normal ethics of exhibition spaces, curators and so on, are quite pushed by Christina's propositions, as in the preceding one, which seems to stumble on its being possible. And this one was not a problem because nobody cares about the fish dying, except that they do care about the chicken dying, which is interesting. So the degrees of closeness that cause outrage in using or working with other non-humans in an artwork. While the fish piece did not cause a problem, nor did the live rabbit piece in New York, the chicken piece does. It seems to not be acceptable, which I'll tell you in a minute. So this piece was called Two Monks and a Rabbit, or A Cosmic Hunger, based on and dedicated to a carrot. And basically she created, she again speaks of it as being about eternal cosmic hunger. And there is a black quadrant, that she lay out on the floor, and she created a game with another person, which has to do with the carrots on the throwing of 2 piles of carrots, one each player has, into the center of this arena. This piece is also a spoof or critique or whatever, referencing Boyce, the piece that I showed yesterday. I mean, she intentionally chose the rabbit and spent time in the New York Gallery with the rabbit, but instead of being alone with the rabbit, it was 2 women and a rabbit and many, many carrots. So no fear of being eaten by the coyote. No, perhaps the rabbit might be afraid of turning into a stew, not the heroic male artist afraid of, or showing he's not afraid because he's entering into this relationship with the coyote. We know that the coyote was quite well fed on the side of that performance, so make sure he wasn't hungry for Boyce. But I still think that's a really key, super key piece. I'm just now referencing the way that Christina sees that piece. So, but the question of eating and who's eating who and who's eating what and the cycles of food in relations are at the root of this piece as well, as in the previous one. So there is a game which is played between the 2 women and the carrots, and the rabbit is somehow an external third party that we have to take into consideration, that is always this, not this leftover, this remainder as Bataille speaks, but it's this other, this non-human world that somehow erupts always within our bodies and without our bodies, and that one can not somehow not address, because the game gets altered by the rabbit, of course. So the 2 women who are playing the game are hoping that they can actually play their game with their certain rules, but their play, and of course it's a reference to art and as being also a form of play and leisure, their play is disrupted by the decisions of this other sentient being, whether he's going to eat the carrots or not, eat the carrots of one of the sides of the 2 players or not. So it's like a game which is contingent on another form of agency.